The greatest threat the Imperium had ever faced was not born in the swirling madness of the warp. It did not arrive on world-devouring bioships from the void between galaxies. It was not an ancient enemy rousing from a tomb world, nor a green tide of fungal barbarism. The greatest threat the Imperium had ever faced was a man with a quill, a seal, and an office. It was a cancer that grew not from alien contamination or heretical doctrine, but from the very heart of the institutions designed to preserve humanity. It was a terror enacted not by monstrous legions, but by scribes and functionaries, by decrees and tithe grades, by the slow, inexorable grinding of a bureaucracy that had forgotten its purpose. This was the Age of Apostasy, and its architect was a High Lord of Terra, a man who would hold in his hands the two pillars of imperial power and use them to hammer the galaxy into a shape of his own monstrous design. His name was Goge Vandire. To understand the rise of such a man, one must first understand the Imperium that forged him. The 36th millennium was an age of gathering dark, a slow slide into decay that had been gestating for 6,000 years. The light of the Emperor, once a beacon of unifying glory, had become a distant, guttering candle. On Terra, the High Lords had grown decadent and insular, their millennia-spanning reigns making them less the shepherds of mankind and more the wardens of a crumbling museum. The Adeptus Terra, the vast and labyrinthine bureaucracy that administered the million worlds of humanity, was sclerotic. Its arteries were choked with redundant offices, its neural pathways clogged with contradictory laws and forgotten protocols. Communication across the vastness of space, ever perilous, grew slower, less reliable. Worlds fell out of contact for centuries only to be rediscovered as alien protectorates or haunted ruins. Warlords carved out petty empires in the border regions, their tithes centuries in arrears, their defiance a quiet insult that the distant throne world lacked the will or the resources to answer. It was in this vacuum of authority and purpose that the Adeptus Ministorum, the Ecclesiarchy, began its ascent. The faith of the God Emperor, once a source of spiritual strength, became a tool of temporal power. The Ministorum preached that the ills of the Imperium were a result of moral laxity, of insufficient faith. The solution was not reform, but purification. Not progress, but a return to a mythical pious past. Their influence swelled, their wealth grew beyond measure from the donations of a terrified populace, and their power began to rival that of the Administratum itself. Cardinal governors ruled entire sectors as their personal fiefdoms, their fratres Templar armies enforcing orthodoxy with fire and sword. A schism tore through the heart of this burgeoning church, as the powerful Cardinal Bucharus of Gathalamor declared himself the true voice of the Emperor, plunging the Segmentum Solar into a bitter and bloody civil war. The Imperium was not merely stagnant. It was tearing itself apart from within. It was into this cauldron of decay, division, and desperate faith that Goge Vandire stepped. He was not at first a monster. The few surviving records of his early career paint the picture of a man of formidable, almost inhuman talent. As the 378th Master of the Administratum, he was a prodigy of logistics and regulation. Where others saw an impassable swamp of bureaucracy, Vandire saw a machine, and he knew precisely which levers to pull. He was ruthless, efficient, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He streamlined tithe collections, purged entire subdivisions of corrupt or incompetent functionaries, and restored a measure of order to the choking machinery of the state. He was hailed as a savior, a man of action in an age of dithering placement. His methods were brutal, his pronouncements absolute, but they produced results. Worlds that had teetered on the brink of collapse were stabilized. Fleets that had been mired in logistical chaos were supplied. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the long decline had been arrested. But Vandire's ambition was not limited to the temporal. He saw the Ecclesiarchy, then under the hedonistic and ineffectual Ecclesiarch, Paulus III, as a source of immense untapped power. A tool of social control whose potential was being squandered on petty politics and opulent indulgence. When Paulus III appointed Vandire as his chancellor, it was seen as a shrewd move to bring the Administratum's efficiency to the chaotic finances of the Ministorum. In truth, it was the fox being invited into the henhouse. Vandire turned his ferocious intellect to the church's sprawling organization. He uncovered scandals, exposed heresies, and used the evidence to systematically dismantle the power bases of his rivals. Cardinals who opposed him found their histories scrutinized, their allies disgraced, their armies disbanded. He presented himself as a pious reformer, a scourge of the corrupt, all while weaving a web of personal loyalty that stretched across the entire segmentum. The death of Paulus III, crushed by a falling statue of himself during a festival, was officially ruled an accident. Few in the upper echelons of the Adeptus Terra believed it, but by then, it was too late. Vandire had positioned himself perfectly. With the backing of the faction he had cultivated within the Holy Synod, he made an unprecedented move. He declared that in this time of ultimate crisis, the defense of mankind's soul and its body must be unified. He put himself forward not merely as the next Ecclesiarch, but as the Ecclesiarch, who would also retain his title as Master of the Administratum. It was a fusion of power that had never been contemplated, a violation of the ancient separation of church and state. The two most powerful of the High Lords of Terra were to be one and the same man. The opposition was vocal, but disorganized. Vandire's supporters were zealous, his arguments persuasive, and his veiled threats undeniable. In a move that would seal the fate of the galaxy for 70 years, the High Lords acquiesced. Goge Vandire became the absolute master of the Imperium in all but name. The period that followed is known as the Reign of Blood, and the name is an understatement. With the full apparatus of both the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy at his command, Vandire's power was absolute. His every decree was law, his every pronouncement holy scripture. The early efficiency that had marked his career curdled into a monstrous, galaxy-spanning paranoia. He saw heresy in every shadow, conspiracy in every whisper. He trusted no one. The Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of High Lords, became a rubber stamp for his edicts, its members terrified of the fate that had befallen those who had questioned his ascension. He ordered vast, vainglorious monuments built in his own honor, their construction draining the resources of entire star systems. The ecclesiarchal palace on Terra swelled into a continent-spanning fortress, a labyrinth of black marble and gilded statuary from which he ruled his empire of fear. His doctrine was one of terror. He preached that the only path to salvation was through absolute, unquestioning obedience to his will. Independent thought was the highest form of heresy. He ordered the burning of libraries, the destruction of art, the purging of histories that did not glorify his name. He unleashed his Frateris Templar, now swollen into a force of billions upon the galaxy. Worlds that failed to meet their tithes, that harbored unsanctioned schools of thought, or that were simply denounced by a rival, were subjected to purges of unimaginable brutality. The death toll climbed from the millions to the billions, then to the trillions. Entire sectors fell silent, their populations martyred for imagined sins. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided interstellar travel, seemed to dim, as if the sheer weight of human suffering was a shroud smothering its light. Yet in the depths of his madness, Vandire made a discovery that would solidify his power and create a symbol of his tyranny that would endure for millennia. On the remote shrine world of San Lior, he found an order of female warrior ascetics known as the Daughters of the Emperor. They were an obscure cult, utterly devoted to the master of mankind. Their martial prowess matched only by the purity of their faith. Vandire saw in them the perfect weapon, a bodyguard with unshakable loyalty, whose devotion was not to him as a man but to the divine authority he claimed to represent. He brought them to Terra, lavished them with the finest arms and armor, and indoctrinated them into his personal cult of personality. They became his praetorian guard, his executioners, his constant companions. He named them the brides of the Emperor, and they saw in him the living voice of the god they revered. They became the final unbreachable wall around his throne, their faith a shield against all reason and all truth. The Imperium bled. It bled from 1,000 fronts, assailed by orcs and Eldari, by rebellion and chaos incursions, but the deepest wounds were self-inflicted. Vandire's paranoia grew into full-blown delusion. The few surviving accounts from his inner circle speak of a man lost to reality. He would spend weeks in seclusion, speaking only to the jewel-encrusted skull of a long-dead saint. He would order the execution of entire naval crews for a perceived lack of zeal in their salutes. He decreed that the color blue was heretical and ordered all planetary governors to repaint their world's skies, a task as impossible as it was insane. His decrees, issued from the suffocating gloom of his palace, became increasingly erratic, contradictory, and violent. The machine of the Imperium, which he had once mastered, now ran wild, fueled by his madness. It was an engine of annihilation, consuming its own people in a pyre of faith and fear. In the darkest night, however, a single candle can seem a sun. That light appeared not on Terra, nor on the great fortress worlds of the Segmentum Solar, but on a forgotten backwater planet named Dimimar. It came in the form of a humble preacher, a man whose name was Sebastian Thor. Thor was everything Vandire was not. Where Vandire was a creature of baroque palaces and labyrinthine politics, Thor walked among the common people. Where Vandire's faith was a cudgel of terror and domination, Thor's was a simple, profound belief in the Emperor's love for humanity and humanity's inherent strength. He preached a message of hope in a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of the word. He spoke not of purges and punishment, but of courage and compassion. He condemned the Lord Vandire not as a heretic, for that would have been a death sentence, but as a man who had lost his way, whose love of power had eclipsed his love for the Emperor. His message was a spark in a forest of dry tinder. It spread from Dimimar through clandestine picked castes and whispered sermons, passed from pilgrim to worker, from guardsman to voidfarer. It was a creed of defiance rooted in the deepest tenets of the imperial faith. Thor's followers, who became known as the Confederation of Light, swelled into a movement of billions. They saw in him the truth of the faith they had been taught, a truth that Vandire had twisted into a monstrous caricature. At first, Vandire, insulated by layers of sycophants and the unshakable faith of his brides, dismissed the movement as a minor peasant uprising. He could not comprehend a threat that did not seek to usurp his titles or seize his treasuries. He failed to understand that Thor was not fighting for power. He was fighting for the soul of the Imperium. The conflict could not remain one of words alone. The first to lend military steel to Thor's spiritual crusade was, improbably, the Adeptus Mechanicus. The fabricator general of Mars, Gastaf Hediatrix, had long chafed under Vandire's irrational demands for archaeotech and his purges of tech priests for ideological failings. When Vandire demanded the ancient Martian treaty with Terra be renegotiated to make Mars a vassal of the Ecclesiarchy, it was the final insult. Hediatrix declared Mars for Sebastian Thor, and the mighty legions of the Scutari and the war machines of the Collegia Titanica were added to the Confederation of Light. This act of defiance broke the dam. Captains of the Imperial Navy, horrified by orders to bombard loyal worlds, mutinied and brought their fleets to Thor's banner. And then the angels of death answered the call. The Adeptus Astartes, who had for centuries remained aloof from the politics of the High Lords, could no longer stand aside. The Imperial Fists, remembering their sacred duty as Praetorians of Terra, declared Vandire a traitor. The zealous Black Templars, seeing the perversion of the faith they championed, launched a crusade against the apostate Ecclesiarch. The Firehawks, the Fists Exemplar, and dozens of other chapters joined them. The Imperium was plunged into the most widespread and devastating civil war since the Horus Heresy. This was not a war of brother against brother in the service of a dark god. It was a war fought within the imperial creed itself, a battle to define the very nature of humanity's future. Lying, the climactic battle of this phase of the war, fought in the skies and on the plains of Gathalamor, saw the Confederation of Light shatter Vandire's fleet and army. The road to Terra was open. The siege of the ecclesiarchal palace was the war's brutal apotheosis. The forces of Thor, a coalition of space marines, Martian Scutari, and countless regiments of the Imperial Guard, laid siege to Vandire's fortress on the throne world itself. The fighting was horrific, a meat grinder of faith and fury. The Frateres Templar, whipped into a frenzy of suicidal devotion, fought for every inch of sacred ground. They were promised martyrdom and paradise, and they died in their millions, their bodies choking the grand avenues and filling the ornate plazas. Above them, the brides of the Emperor fought with superhuman skill and zeal, their faith in Vandire absolute. They were the Emperor's chosen, and they would not allow these blasphemers to touch the man they believed was his living voice. They held the line against the fury of Space Marine assaults, their bolters and power swords a match for the angels of death. For a year the siege ground on. The cost in lives was astronomical. Terra itself, the most sacred world in the galaxy, was being destroyed by its own defenders. And through it all, the great gates of the Imperial Palace, the Sanctum Imperialis, remained sealed. Within its walls, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own companions, remained silent. They were sworn to protect the master of mankind, not to interfere in the squabbles of his servants. To break their vigil and march on the ecclesiarchal palace would be to choose a side in a political conflict, a thing they had not done in 6,000 years. To remain silent, however, was to watch the Imperium's heart be torn out. The stalemate was absolute, the future of humanity hanging on a razor's edge. The deadlock was broken not by a Titan legion or a cyclonic torpedo, but by a quiet word and a single journey. A lone custodian, a centurion whose name is not recorded, left the imperial palace under a banner of parley. He did not go to the commanders of the besieging army. He went to the front lines, to the sanctum defended by the brides of the emperor. He sought out their leader, Alicia Dominica, and her chief lieutenants. He did not come with threats or arguments. He came with a simple, terrible offer, an audience with the master of mankind himself. To the brides, who had been told for years that Vandire was the emperor's voice, the offer was both blasphemy and an irresistible test of their faith. Leaving their forces in command, Dominica and her inner circle followed the custodian through the maelstrom of the battlefield, through the silent, echoing halls of the imperial palace to the great eternity gate itself, What happened within the throne room is perhaps the greatest unsung mystery in imperial history. The records are silent on this point, a void of information that speaks more loudly than any chronicle. No one knows what they saw. No one knows what, if anything, the Emperor communicated to them. Did they witness the raw, agonizing power of the master of mankind, a psychic supernova held in check by arcane machinery? Did he speak to them directly, his thoughts cutting through the fog of Vandire's lies? Or did they simply stand in that sacred, silent chamber and realize the profound galactic scale of their betrayal, that they had been guarding a screaming, paranoid charlatan while the true heart of the Imperium suffered in silence? None can say for certain. But when Alicia Dominica and her sisters emerged from the Sanctum Imperialis, the fervent zeal in their eyes had been replaced by a cold, terrifying certainty. Their faith had not been broken. It had been reforged into a weapon of righteous vengeance. They returned to the ecclesiarchal palace not as its defenders, but as its judges. They spoke no word to the besieging armies. They simply began to fight their way back towards Vandire's throne room. The Fratres Templar, confused by this apparent betrayal, tried to stop them. They were cut down. Those of the brides of the Emperor who had not accompanied Dominica, who remained loyal to Vandire, met their sisters in brutal, desperate combat. Sororitas fought sororitas in the marbled corridors, their battle cries a mixture of fury and bewildered grief. But Dominica and her chosen companions were unstoppable, their purpose absolute. They smashed through the final doors of Vandire's personal sanctum and stood before the High Lord of Terra. Goge Vandire, even at the end, was not a cowering wretch. He was surrounded by his last loyal guards, perched on a throne of gold and bone, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He could not comprehend their actions. He had given them everything. He was their master, the voice of the divine. In his mind, their defiance was not just treason, it was a logical impossibility, a tear in the fabric of reality. He rose, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. "I am the Ecclesiarch. My word is the Emperor's word. You are traitors to him," he screamed, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. Alicia Dominica stepped forward, her face grim, her storm bolter leveled. She did not waste breath on argument or explanation. She simply gave voice to the cold, hard truth that had been revealed to her in the darkness of the throne room. "You are not the Emperor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You speak only for yourself." Vandire opened his mouth to retort, to unleash another torrent of threats and divine proclamations, but he was cut short. A single declarative sentence from Dominica sealed his fate and became the founding words of a new order. "We have seen the truth of the Emperor's will," she stated. Then to one of her companions she gave the simple final command. The bolt pistol cracked, and the rain of blood was over. A less-known legend, however, holds that Dominica herself pronounced Vandire a heretic and traitor, and after he declared he had no time to die, she answered, "It is not for you to decide," before executing him with her own blade. The truth, like so much of that era, is lost to the fog of war. The death of Goge Vandire did not end the Age of Apostasy. It took another decade of brutal warfare, the scouring, to hunt down his loyalist warlords and cleanse the worlds that still clung to his toxic dogma. The Imperium was left shattered, its population decimated, its faith broken. Sebastian Thor, hailed as a savior, became the new Ecclesiarch. He was a good and pious man who dedicated the rest of his life to rebuilding what Vandire had destroyed. One of his first and most important acts was the Decree Passive, an edict stating that the Ecclesiarchy shall henceforth never again maintain men under arms. It was a law designed to prevent any future ecclesiarch from amassing a private army as Vandire had. But it was a law with a subtle, crucial loophole. Alicia Dominica and her reformed warrior order were not men. The brides of the emperor were reborn as the orders militant of the Adepta Sororitas, the unarmed daughters of the emperor. They would serve as the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition, and as the righteous fury of the Ecclesiarchy itself, their existence a clever circumvention of the law, and a permanent living reminder of the apostasy. And so the great lesson of Goge Vandire was learned, and then immediately half forgotten. He was not a demon prince or an alien conqueror. He was a functionary, a product of a system that had become so vast, so complex, so burdened by its own weight that it could no longer police itself. He rose to power not by conquering the Imperium, but by mastering its own rules. His weapons were ink, parchment, and procedure. His legions were clerks and tax collectors long before they were soldiers. He proved that the slow, creeping rot of bureaucracy could be more deadly than the fastest fleet, that the tyranny of the seal and stamp could crush more worlds than any bombardment. Vandire was dead, but the Adeptus Terra lived on. The offices he held, Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, still exist. The labyrinthine structures of power, the potential for corruption, the temptation to use faith as a weapon of control, these things were not purged with his death. They are an indelible part of the Imperium's nature. The Age of Apostasy stands as the eternal grim monument to a terrible truth: that the greatest threat to humanity's survival will not always come from the stars. Sometimes it will come from a desk, cloaked in authority, armed with the law, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness. And now, as the galaxy darkens once more, and the institutions of mankind are tested to their limits, the shadow of Goge Vandire looms long, a quiet, ominous warning that the Imperium's greatest enemy has always been, and will always be, itself.